Hello, my name is Stacy. I am the host of the Human Experience. Today we're going to be interviewing Miss Melanie Carter Hack. Our discussion is really on resiliency. However, as always, when we come together and we're able to engage in discussions, all kinds of things can come out. So I have known Melanie for, I guess, approximately 5 years now. It seems like. We are colleagues and over time have become budding friends, which has been really, really great. Melanie is licensed as a marriage and family therapist, amongst many other great skills. And so I have her here today just to kind of have an open discussion about resiliency and kind of her experience, strength, and hope. Like I said, today is all about the human experience, and so we are being about as real as possible. So, hi, Melanie.
Hello, how are you today?
Doing good. So we have some disclaimers just basically saying that our humanness might show up as in the middle of our taping. So I'm really good at tripping over my words and all that kind of fun stuff. So that shows the human spot. So I wanted to kind of kick off today's discussion just about your thoughts about the word resilience. What's your definition?
When I consider that word resiliency, I think in our field in particular, it's a word that we like to throw around quite a bit, but it has so much meaning and it can mean different things for different people. But when I think about resiliency, I think about sort of like this inner strength of being able to overcome a variety of different things in your life. And again, those can vary based on the person because resiliency isn't the same for every single person. It is finding this part of ourself to be able to figure out how in the world am I going to overcome these barriers or these difficulties or this trauma that I have experienced. And I think over time, that resiliency can ebb and flow. But maybe there are times in our life when our resiliency is very high. And we can deal with those stressors. We can deal with things that get thrown up in our face. But man, there's other times that for whatever reason, our resiliency might be much lower, and it's even harder of a struggle to try to overcome those things or those struggles that we're facing.
Sure. Do you think that people can learn to build that strength? Do you think that people can sort of take not coping skills, but I guess for lack of better words, like different skill sets and kind of build or cultivate more resilient lifestyles?
Oh, definitely. And even when you think about just parenting in general or raising a child, that like we are building resiliency in our children from birth on up because we're teaching them things, we're teaching them skills, we're teaching them fortitude and determination to try to navigate the world that we live in. And so, even by teaching your child how to problem solve, how to
Sure.
use conflict resolution skills, any of those things that we don't maybe necessarily connect to the term resiliency, that's what it boils down to, is because we're trying to teach children, even we're trying to teach ourselves,
Sure.
how can we have inner strength to overcome things when we're met with stressors or a variety of issues.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that that's an important skill. Like you said, just in not only just because a lot of people know. For me, I work in the field of addiction, and I work with folks who are on a daily basis demonstrating tremendous amounts of resiliency. But when we talk about life on life's terms and kind of broaden it away from addiction, I think that all people have to find sort of that the ability to kind of bounce back from life events and life experiences. And for you, and some of the folks that have met you through our experience and just in general, you are probably by far one of the most resilient women I know. And that's kind of hands down. That's probably an understatement, to be honest with you, but that's the best. Kind of like I said to you earlier, when I think of you, those things kind of come hand in hand. Um, what's your thought about kind of gaining that strength through your journey?
Well, I guess I had never used that term ever to describe myself or to ever think of that until I was faced with one of the most difficult things that any human being can ever experience, and that was the loss of my daughter. And so for some of those people who may not know my daughter Reagan's story, in 2014, Reagan was a 7th grader at Bardstown Middle School. And, Reagan would be considered one of your typical 12-year-olds. She loved her cell phone. She had friends. She was involved in school. She, played sports. There was nothing on our radar whatsoever that would have led me to suspect that she was struggling with something in her. And during that year in particular, this is a transition. 7th grade is hard for almost every kid in some shape or form because it's this transition from elementary school to middle school. The social aspect becomes so important in a preteen and a teenager's life. And so that was the year in particular Reagan started to experience bullying. Now, a lot of times when we think about this term bullying, we all tend to have a preconceived notion
Sure.
that the child who's being bullied is, maybe the kid who wears the glasses or keeps off to themselves, is maybe more of a loner, and they tend to be, targeted. But that is not the case. Reagan did not fit that sort of stereotype that we tend to have. She was considered one of the popular ones in her class. She had friends. She was always doing something with people. And so when that started to happen to our family and to her in particular, we struggled with that. And so protective mama bear came out. I would go to the school, try to get it addressed. And we just kept hitting barrier after barrier. And I'll never forget the day that I went to the school for the first time because she had called me crying. And it was a group of 4 girls that were targeting her. And what it ended up boiling down to was one of those 4 girls liked a boy that liked Reagan instead. So they took it out on her. And I remember her calling me on her cell phone from school and crying, saying, please come get me. Please come get me. I don't want to stay here. And so she told me a little bit about what had happened in terms of these girls were spreading rumors about her, were giving her dirty looks in the hallway. And so I said, okay, I'm coming down, but I'm going to talk to the principal. Well, we know that most kids do not want parents to intervene. And she said, no, please don't do it. It's going to make it worse. But I felt as her parent, I had to protect her. I had to sort of nip this in the bud. So I went in, I talked to the principal, and it was minimized. It was brought up as, well, this is teenage drama. We'll talk to him about it. We'll get it addressed. It'll be fine. And I remember going out into my van and crying. And I called my husband so upset. And I told him what had happened. And he said, well, why are you so upset? And I said, because I'm afraid she's going to stop talking and telling us about it. Because if she feels like nobody's going to be there to help or nobody's going to be able to fix the problem, then why even go through it?
Right. If nothing's going to be done, what's the point in even speaking on it?
And what's the point? And so then she started to go inward even more. And so that was my fear. And during the months from like September until December, it would sort of come and go. There'd be periods where, things would die down, but then it would start back up. And again, when we looked at bullying in Reagan's situation, it was never physical. Like those girls never wanted to put their hands on her. But they did the intimidation. They did the spreading the rumors. A lot of it was done on social media in regards to like her Instagram post or her pictures. They would make really negative comments, rude comments, you're ugly, all those types of things. And so as a parent, we did the monitoring apps. We made her change passwords. We blocked them, but kids are way smarter than I am.
Sure.
When it comes to
I get that.
they would just create new ones. So it got to the point in December where, we as a family decided this is enough. We're going to change schools, which was heartbreaking because she was the victim and yet she was the one that was having to sacrifice everything.
Sure.
But she knew this. We talked about it. We said maybe a fresh start, going somewhere new. And again, these were just 4 girls. 4 girls in her world had caused this much turbulence and turmoil.
And a lot of time, Melanie, like people will say things like, oh, if that's my kid, I'm gonna go to the parent's house and I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do that. How did you and your husband kind of contend with wanting to go above the school's head and kind of go around them?
That was a big struggle because, again, understanding HIPAA, which is those confidentiality laws, I understand it as a professional, but that was one of the first situations that I so hated that, because when I asked the principal in particular, well, why can't we all come to a meeting at the school? Why can't we do this as a team approach? Then it was, well, I can offer that to them, but they don't have to abide by that. And I can't share their information with you because of HIPAA, because of the
Sure.
confidentiality. So that was one of our struggles. And again, we were not raised in Bardstown. So we moved in 2008. So I knew Reagan's close friends. I knew their parents, but I didn't know everybody else's parents like you would if you were raised and lived in a very small community.
Sure.
So that was our only connection, was like the school personnel, to try to address this, and having hope and faith that they were doing what they said they were going to do, or abiding by what was in the best interest of the child. And so in December, there was 1 week left in school, and she wanted to go to a ball game. And she said, I just want to go. It's going to be the last time I'm going to get to be there as a Bardstown middle schooler. And I just want to go and hang out with my friends. So I let her go with her friend and her friend's father. And unbeknownst to me, unfortunately, at that ball game, there had been another bullying incident. So when I picked up Reagan from the ball game, she didn't say anything. She got in the car just like she always did. Went into her room, had ate dinner, went to her room, and we were getting ready for bed. And she came out, and I was in the kitchen, and she came out and she said, "Mama, I feel like I need to go to the hospital." So I'm like, "What? Why? What's going on?" And she said, "Well, I feel like I'm going to pass out." Okay, like what is it, your head or your stomach? What's going on? Why do you think you're going to pass out? And she looked at me and she said, "Because I've taken pills." So of course my stomach drops, and then I'm like, "Oh my God, what did you take?" So we run into her bedroom, and she shows me a bottle of prescription cough medicine, those Tussin pearls that she had been prescribed, I think probably like a year ago. That was in the medicine cabinet. Again, was cough medicine. And I said, "How many did you take?" She said, "I don't know." So we run back into the kitchen. I'm getting my clothes on because we were in our pajamas. And I hollered for our oldest son. And I said, "Call 911." So we have 911 on the phone. And I looked at Reagan and I said, "You're going to be sick. We're going to go to the hospital and they're going to pump your stomach. You're going to be sick, but you're going to be okay." And she looked at me, and she was standing across from me in the kitchen. And I said, "Reagan, why would you do this?" And she said, "I'm tired of everybody hating me."
Mm.
And so that was the last words that I heard her say before she collapsed. In her world, 4 people was everybody. The impact that one or more people can have in someone's life is tremendous and monumental. And Reagan laid in a coma for the next 5 days before we lost her. And even while she was laying in the hospital, those girls, one or two in particular, were still continuing to write some of the most horrific things on her Instagram page. And again, my husband was pretty adamant too, like, "You're not going to read what they're saying."
Right.
But when we talk about empathy, in terms of being able to understand and feel what another human being is going through, or experiencing, like, those two in particular had no empathy whatsoever, which is very scary.
Yeah.
That's a scary situation to be in. And so, at that moment, December the 18th, 2014, like my life changed. That would never, like, I was never going to be the same. Our family was never going to be the same. Like, my world had been turned upside down. And so, like, that concept of resiliency had not even remotely entered my mind at that point in time. Like, I was barely surviving.
Mm.
For 3.5 weeks, I laid on the couch. I hardly moved. My family had to step in to take care of our youngest daughter because she was one. She was just a little over 1 year old. Reagan's sister was at that time. And so, like, I was barely functioning at that point in time. And I remember my best friends had come up, and there were 4 of them. We've been friends since 6th grade. And they had come up, and, I remember us sitting on the couch together, and they had went into Reagan's room because it was exactly the same. Like, nobody touched it, nobody do anything. And we happened to look on the back of her door, and she had, teenager stuff, posted pictures and writings and drawings and all of these things on the back of her door. And we were like lifting up different pages, and we found this bucket list. And so I'd never seen it. I didn't even know she wrote anything like that. And it was 63 items that she had on her bucket list that ranged from riding an elephant to adopting a hedgehog, patching a lock on a love bridge, going scuba diving, all of these just out jumping off a waterfall, like all of these really intense experiences that a 12-year-old had somehow decided, I want to do these things in my life. And there were 63 of them. And I remember holding it and, of course, just squalling and crying. And my friend looked at me and she said, you know what you have to do, right? And I looked at her and she said, you have to do those things for her. Like, you have to do this bucket list for her. And so at that moment in time, then that became one of my purposes, was to do these things for her in her memory and her honor. And then as I continued to go through that grieving process, it became even more important for me as well to make sure that she was never forgotten, because I even started to reflect inward on, family members that I had lost, grandparents, that we all too often lose touch with our grief and our memories of that person. Like, of course, maybe the first couple of weeks to a couple of months, it's really intense. But then we stop talking about them. And I said I would not let that happen to Reagan, because she was important. She did have a life. She had a name. She had a face. She had a purpose in this world. She had a story. And that if I wasn't the one that was going to share that, to keep that alive as her mother, then who would? Like, who would step into that place more than her mama would? So that became my meaning. That became my purpose of putting one foot in front of the other. And so it required me getting up out of bed every day. We created a foundation in her memory, which is called Reagan's Voice Foundation. And the purpose of that was to promote awareness to the impact of bullying and suicide prevention. Because even through those weeks and months after we lost Reagan, the community rallied around us in ways that I would have never expected. People reaching out to us, sharing their stories about how their child had been bullied. Parents who were reaching out to me because they had lost their child. And, being able to feel that I'm not the only one that is going through this experience, and being able to connect to people on that deeper level. Again, that this isn't an isolated incident. It sure wasn't the first situation that had happened to a child, and that we wanted somehow by sharing Reagan's story to hopefully give hope and meaning to kids who were experiencing bullying, to help support them, to help them feel like they aren't alone. So that way, in a moment of darkness, they don't make that final choice or that final decision where they don't feel like it's going to get any better. Because for her, it was, these four people have caused so much pain for me that I'm struggling with being able to see the 100 other people in my world that love me and care about me, because that becomes to get dark when we're so wrapped up in the bad things that are going on.
Sure. Do you remember the first time you chose to share Reagan's story publicly? Do you remember what kind of drove you at that point to make that? Because I know at this point you've been asked to speak in a lot of different venues and a lot of different. But do you remember the first time? Do you remember what kind of what was going on at that point when you were like, okay, I finally found the courage to kind of speak publicly about this?
Well, I would say there were probably two different scenarios. Right after we lost Reagan, it was within a couple of weeks, then the news media started to get a hold of it. And again, we lost Reagan December the 23rd. So 2 days before Christmas. Our Christmas tree was still up. Our presents were wrapped under the tree for her. And so that story became very riveting for the community and for the media at that particular time, because it was not only about losing a child, which is the most horrific thing that any parent can ever go through, but it was also at this time of year that is supposed to be about belonging and love and peace. And then it also hit an area that people know about that sometimes people don't want to talk about,
Sure.
in bullying and harassment. And yes, all of our schools had their own bullying policy. But later I would come to find out that that was completely different, per jurisdiction. But, being interviewed for a news story was probably the first time that I had to put words to it. Um, and so that was very emotional. But again, it was what drove me at that point in time was to make sure that Reagan's story was heard,
Sure.
and that there would be follow up to hopefully make sure that something was done in the school system to keep that from happening to another child, in regards to repeatedly reaching out to school administration to say, hey, help us.
Mm.
Like, we don't know what else to do. This is not only happening on school grounds, but it was happening primarily in social media. But we were constantly given the explanation of, well, if it's done outside of school, there's nothing that we can really do about it. But then that was a naive approach to think that what happens at a child's home or after school hours does not impact them as soon as they come back into that school the next day at 8 a.m.,
Mhm.
especially on social media where it is nonstop. It's going 24 hours. Our kids don't get any reprieve from that.
So it's like
And
deflecting blame.
yes, yeah,
Mm.
and sort of pushing it off. And so sharing her story to the news media was to not only share her experience and to reach out to others, but to also hopefully help promote change to where this became an issue that everybody was talking about, because I knew Reagan was not the only one that had went through that in that school and many other schools. Like, as a professional, I knew those things had happened. But for it to hit so close to me and my child, then it became like in your face.
Sure. And
And
I think, oh, sorry, go
uh,
ahead.
one of the next time that, in terms of, I reached out to like more of a community based, was one of my best friends had asked me to come. She was a teacher at a school down in Tennessee, and she said, I don't know if you would be willing. And this was probably going on probably about 5 months after we had lost Reagan. And she said, I would love for you to be able to come to share Reagan's story and talk about bullying. And so that was the first time I had to get up in front of people. And I don't like to public speak. It's very anxiety provoking. Um, but I don't know, there was this driving force behind me because it was about her. It was about her. And again, pushing myself to remember, if I don't do it for her, who's going to do it? And so there was a lot of tears. This is 5 years later, and obviously I still cry.
Sure.
I have no shame for that. Tears are not a bad thing. Um, and so that was probably the first time. And I remember after the fact, so many kids coming up and hugging me and saying, I've been through the same thing, and I had moments where I was thinking about that. Or there was one in particular that day I'll never forget, who came up and said, that she was thinking about that.
Wow.
And she said, but I don't want to cause my family pain like I see you in pain.
Wow.
And so, it's those types of people that I see that keeps me moving forward to share her story, because I know so many of our kids are suffering in silence or feeling that hopelessness, that they don't know what else to do. They've told, nobody's doing anything about it, or it can't be done. It keeps getting pushed off. And and not feeling like there's anybody there who's listening or can feel and can understand what they're going through. And so, that was sort of where, and again, my best friend who came up to me, and of course we were all crying, that ugly cry that we sometimes do. And she was like, you have to keep going forward with it, because she said, you're impacting too many people. Like Reagan is impacting too many people. Like, you can't stop. And so that's what has continued to help me gain that courage to continue to get up and share Reagan's story and be real with people, not only as her mother, but also just as a human being. Of, you know, this is horrible. Like, this is horrific to know that somebody can tear someone down to the point that they think it's never going to get better, and that their only choice is to end their life. Like, I would never want anybody to feel that, because it is a very, very dark place. And you shut out everything else. Like, you shut out all of the rest of the light and life because of that. And I got close to that. And I remember that those 3 to 4 weeks where I just laid on the couch and I couldn't move and I couldn't think of anything but her, and how would my life ever, ever be able to move forward without my child. And as a professional, working with substance use, working with depression, suicidal thoughts, I could always understand it cognitively, but I had never felt it at that deep emotion. For the first time in my life, being able to understand why someone would want to turn to something to make them forget, to make them not feel for minutes, even just minutes, to not have to feel that excruciating pain.
Just
That
to
was the
shut it
first,
off a little bit.
yeah, to just like not be, like, just not to be. And so that was the first time that I could truly empathize with people who have resorted to drugs or alcohol to try to numb and to cope. But I didn't, and as I talk to people about that, that's one of the things that I even self-reflect on, of why didn't I? The thought definitely crossed my mind many times, but yet I didn't. But I also know that, working with grieving parents over the past 5 years, I've seen such a fluctuation in how each of us have handled the grief and the loss. There's definitely similarities in their experiences, again, thoughts, feelings, behaviors that we all tend to do. But there's also big differences in terms of how we have coped with that. And that sort of brought me up, and I know that's where you and I started to explore and discuss that concept of resiliency of, is it a matter of people have different levels of resiliency, that two people can go through pretty much the exact same experience, but because of their inner workings and their past experiences and things that have just continued to build, that they can handle it in two different ways. That one person goes down this path and the other person goes down the other path. And that did become sort of this new term, that when I talk about grief and loss, it's a term that's now, in my mind at least, so connected to this term of resiliency, because we can also see resiliency comes and goes. It can be high at moments, and then, man, it can drop and it can be really low as well. But and figuring out, how can I keep building this momentum to keep trying to move forward and put one foot in front of the other, so I don't remain stuck.
Mhm. And even within the same family, even within a family who has dealt with, the same experience in essence, or that same kind of, um, I don't want to say circumstances, but in essence, sort of like, even members of the family will demonstrate different levels of resiliency at different times because of the impact that it had, and how people cope. Would you say that it's accurate to say that different people within your immediate circle even handled it different and continue to handle it different?
Oh yeah, definitely. And probably in our family system, there's some of us that talk about Reagan daily, openly, because that, especially for me, and that applies specifically to me as well, like, that is my way of keeping her alive. Like, I don't want her to be this thing that we forget about. Like, she is my child, and I talked about her every day when she was here in my presence in front of me, where I could hold her and touch her and see her face, smell her. Like, I talked about her and bragged about her every day. So why would I do anything different just because I'm not able to physically touch her like I was before? But there's others in our family that it hurts so much that that's their way of coping, is that they can't talk about her all of the time like that because it's so painful.
Sure.
And it took some processing for me to understand that more, and not judge them for not handling their grief the way that I handle my grief, because we handle it differently. And again, that can go back to resiliency, that can go back to coping strategies, like that can be chalked up to a variety of different things. But I did have to get to that understanding and acceptance of, just because they don't handle it the way that I do doesn't mean that they love her any less than I do. So yeah, I definitely agree. I saw it firsthand that even in one family unit, you can handle it so differently.
Thank you. Well, and I know that, and you and I have talked about this before, and I'm curious if you have any feedback for our viewers, because I know, a lot of times people will see somebody go through this, or they themselves will go through it, and other folks don't know how to be supportive, and so they'll say things with great intentions that are hurtful, or they'll. So, do you have like advice for maybe people who are, sort of in the supportive role, of like how to best respect somebody, how, so because and you said this earlier when you were talking about like people tend to kind of deflect from bullying. I think people are scared to get into the messy with folks, like people are scared to get into the emotional side of humanity. They're scared to hurt with people. They're scared of suffering. Like there's this sort of belief system in our country that we shouldn't have to suffer, everything should just be unicorns and butterflies, and that's just not life. So do you have any, kind of feedback for someone who might be like, man, I really want to be supportive or come alongside somebody, I just don't know how?
You know, I think we all fall into those platitudes that we say to people, especially during grief and loss. It's like you said, it's so uncomfortable. And like we begin to tiptoe almost to a fault around the person who is grieving, because we don't want to say anything that brings it up. And I, even though there was so much of a fog in those days, like at her service and at her memorial service, that, even today, 5 years later, like I'll have to ask my husband, was so and so there? Just because I had detached at that point. I was numb. Um, but I remember sometimes people coming up to me and saying, again, the well-meaning, intentional platitudes, but in my mind wanting to scream, did you really just say that to me? Like, did you really just say that to me? But again, what was always in the back of my mind, I remember for those 2 days in particular, was, Reagan was a preteen. She was 12, and Lord knows she never wanted to be embarrassed.
Mm.
And so that was like always in the back of my mind when I wanted to yell or I wanted to scream or I wanted to throw myself on her, you know, to think Reagan would be so embarrassed,
Mm.
and I can't do that to her. Like, I cannot do that to her. Like, this is for her. This is about her. Like, I cannot embarrass her in that way. And so, sometimes it got to a point where, and my best friends were really skilled at this in particular, sometimes there's nothing that you can say. Sometimes it's just being there and being honest to say, I, I don't know what to say. Like, there are no words that I can say to you that's going to ease your pain.
Sure.
But I'm here, and sometimes it's just sitting with that person or listening to them cry or listening to them vent, because there's nothing that can take away that pain. No amount of words that you say, no amount of saying they're in a better place. Um, you'll reunite with them sometime in the future. That doesn't take that pain away.
Sure.
And for some people, that is helpful, but it's not going to be helpful for everybody.
Mm.
And being willing to talk about their loved one who's now gone. So many people, even still today, are like, well, I don't want to make you cry, or I was afraid to talk about her or ask you a question because I didn't want to upset you or make you cry. And I tell people, like, I cry regardless. Like, that is not something that is shameful for me. I want people to talk about Reagan. Like, I want to talk to her to people, because, again, that keeps her memory alive. That keeps her story alive, because she was somebody. She was my daughter. She was this amazingly cool 12-year-old who was gorgeous and smart and had the biggest heart of gold. Like, she was going to do amazing things in this world.
Mhm.
She's just doing it in a different way than we would have ever imagined.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I watched so you have started the bucket list. And I watched your video that you sent me yesterday. That was incredible. That was so incredible. How many of the 63 have you completed so far?
I think we're up to 27. I think that was the list that was, we created a video, and I stink at technology. So it has taken me 4 years to find somebody to be able to put this together. And again, it was one of my best friends from high school, and she did a amazing job with it. But it was, sort of these snapshots, because we video record everything that I do when I'm doing the bucket list. And it's funny because people are like, oh, like, mark that one off because I've done that. And I'm like, that's not how it works. I love it that you're doing it with me too, but like, I've got to go through it. I've got
Right.
to do things for her because that's my purpose, right? Like, that's me finding meaning after losing her. And
Mhm.
so I've done things. I've rode an elephant. I've went, oh my gosh, now I've got to think. We went to Paris, we attached a lock on the Love Bridge. We saw the Eiffel Tower. We sat on a rooftop and looked at the Eiffel Tower. Um, I've kissed a stranger. I've adopted a baby hedgehog, like all of these things that have. And when I talk about her bucket list, and it was a training that I went to in December, which was probably a pivotal point in my life since losing my daughter, was it was with a well-known expert on grief and loss in this country, David Kessler. And he talked throughout that day, and like so many things just kept hitting me of like, oh my gosh, that's what I feel, that's what I've thought. And I've never, things that I wasn't able to put into words. But after the seminar, I was able to talk to him a little bit and was telling him about the bucket list. And he was like, that is so amazing. That is your meaning. And he said, my question for you is, what is it like for you when you do these things? And I said, these are things that I would have never pushed myself to do. I would have never went skydiving. I would have never jumped off a waterfall. I would have never probably taken the time to find a zebra and pet a zebra. I would have never gotten a tattoo, and now I have two because it was on her bucket list. And I said, these were pretty much all things that I would have never forced myself to do or even thought of doing. But I have now. And so she has opened up this door for me of life and of living, because for so long after losing her, I was alive, but I wasn't living.
Sure.
And those are two different things. And so he said, what's it like for you when you do each of these things for her? And I said, well, sometimes they're terrifying, obviously. But then every time I do something, I connect with her because I can see her smiling, or I can see her rolling her eyes as I'm screaming, plummeting towards the earth. I can see her rolling her eyes and saying, Mama, in that voice that she always did. So it's a deep connection for me to have with her when I do all of these things. And it's, again, it's teaching me how to live again, because that got lost for a long time.
I want to thank you for even just the courage to come on and kind of share on your experience and share, because like you said, I think a lot of families deal with grief and loss and suffering. A lot of families don't really know how to get back up. It's kind of one of those situations where I think a lot of people feel guilt in moving forward. Kind of like, I don't have the right to move forward. I don't have the right to go back into living. Um, and so I appreciate you just kind of sharing that, because it's not an easy decision. Like, a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, well, that was 2 years ago. You should be over it now, or you should be doing this. And, folks have a lot of advice to give people on how long they should and shouldn't grieve and what they should and shouldn't do. And so I appreciate you being very open about, like, this has been a process, and at different stages of the game. Some of those stages have been a little bit easier, and some of them are just that, kind of kick you in the gut, not going to drag out fights of moving on and letting go, and not so much in terms of like the memory, like you said, but just like of that being stuck.
Yes. And you made a good point that oftentimes we worry about what other people are thinking, or like people in grief are scanning other people's facial expressions or their tone of voice, because you start to worry that other people are thinking, well, that was so many years ago, like, why aren't you over this? And one of the most, again, why that training in December was so pivotal for me was, again, it gave words to things that I had been thinking. But he said two very important things. Number one, he said, people ask, like, how long will I grieve? And he said, my answer to them is, how long will your loved one be gone? Like, forever. You will grieve forever. You will grieve for as long as that person is away from you. But there's different stages that you referred to. And that part, when I went to December, was about this stage of grief, because if people have heard or read much about grief, there tends to be stages of grief, and these stages are not linear by any stretch of the imagination, but people tend to go through these in some shape or form, and their denial, bargaining, depression, anger, um, and at some point, eventually acceptance. Acceptance meaning not that you wanted this to happen, but that you come to the acceptance that there's not anything that you can do to change it. But he said there's this next stage, and that was where I really found myself struggling to even get to that point of how do I find meaning in life after I've lost my loved one? You know, after my daughter was gone and she was not here with me, I wasn't going to be able to see those milestones or experience those things with her, like her learning to drive, high school graduation, getting married, having children. Like I struggled with so much of the what ifs and what should have been, that I was stuck in terms of not being able to find a meaning. And he said that's one of the most pivotal, but also the hardest things when you're grieving is trying to figure out how is your life going to be? How can you find meaning in life and find a purpose to live after you've lost your loved one? And, you know, those are when that resiliency comes into play. You got to dig deep. Like there are some days that it takes everything you have to pull the covers off of you and to put 2 feet down on the floor. You know, anniversaries can be so difficult. Um, and it's that constant reminder of trying to take yourself to that point of resiliency and that finding the meaning and finding the purpose of, okay, what choice do I have? All right, we do have several choices, but which choice do I need to make? And what do I have to do to get to that point where I can keep moving forward? It's not something that you ever get over. Never. And I tell people all the time when they say, you know, you're like, how are you? Well, there's some days that are more tolerable than others. But my life and even me as a person is not the same as what it was before December the 18th, 2014. And I've come to that acceptance that it's not the same and it's not ever going to be the same. You know, those are those things that people who've went through some form of grief, and we know grief isn't just always when you lose someone who's passed away. Grief can be many other things, such as, you know, a very significant trauma in your life, a significant breakup, a significant relationship. Like we grieve those types of things. And it's figuring out how to be able to move through those things. And that's the definition of resilience. How do we manage to move through it?
I love that. I think that that's, I mean, I think that's spot on. I think, like I said, I think that that is the heartbeat of what we're talking about. And as you're talking, the thing that keeps running through my mind is resiliency in a lot of ways is about love and connection. It's about experiencing and expressing life. Because one of the things that I think that you've done in the time I've known you is focus. Yes, we'll talk about the loss, but you talk about life. You talk about memories and laughter and joy. You talk about, you know, the beautiful things about Reagan. You talk about the beautiful things that made her whole. And I think that that's the thing that I want. I think that's that part that really fuels the resiliency. Was it was like there was life, and when there's life, especially a mother's love and a mother's connection, you know, that I think that keeps her very vibrant and very effective, if you will. I mean, that's probably in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, but the impact that your friend was talking about is, you know, this is not one of those kind of textbook characters. This is a person who was, you know, very much so a part of your story, a part of this kind of world. And so I think that that's a really, really great thing. Okay, so last question and we'll be free. Ready for it? If you have the opportunity to voice one thing that you would like somebody to get from Reagan's if there is one thing that you're like, man, no matter what I say and how long I speak, I hope that everybody who hears her story walks away with this, what would it be?
I'm going to use her words in particular because we did find a video that she had made, and she had made um, a couple of years before 2014 based on her haircut. I'm guessing she was probably like 10 or 11. Um, and it was actually like a public service announcement. And it was so amazing to hear her. So if people have not seen Reagan's video, go to our Facebook page, Reagan's Voice Foundation, and look up Reagan's video, because these are her words. And I would probably tell everybody these two very simple words: stay strong. That was the title of her video. And it is so powerful because we all go through bad things in our life. It might be different forms, it might be different levels, but we all go through bad things in our life. And when you think about staying strong and resiliency, those are so intertwined. Um, and so, for anyone going through very difficult times in their life, those would probably be the words that I would tell them: is stay strong.
Excellent. And with your permission, I'll try to attach the videos to the bottom of this on our YouTube channel. I am not tech savvy, so I'm not making any promises. As we've got,
Would not do it either.
yeah, I don't. As we said, today is kind of our first entry into this series, and so Melanie, I appreciate you coming. I really do. I appreciate us having this conversation. I've been telling people one of the things I love the most about what I see the human experience looking like in terms of this series and moving forward is it almost feels like somebody's just kind of eavesdropping on a conversation we would have anyway. That you just have people who are like, look, let's get into the messy, let's get into the dark, let's get into the love, let's get into the connection. Let's get into that. Because I think that there is a tremendous amount of value in being present with somebody, being fully engaged, because I think that our sense of love and belonging is what is the foundation of all things. And, even if you just feel like you got that one person who you can really invest in and they invest in you, it makes it worth it. And that's not scared of kind of getting into that. So I know as a person, as a professional, I hear, a lot of our common friends say, that's one of the things they love about you. You're not scared to get into the raw and authentic and real. And I'm like, no, you're not scared of that.
No.
So
Because,
that's
because if we don't do it, who's going to, right?
right. Well, and the truth is a lot of us exist in that place and we exist there alone because nobody will get in with us. And I think there's a difference between staying there and kind of being stuck and having somebody say, hey, you know what? I've been here before. Let me show you how to come out. You take this journey, you take this path as quick or slow as you want to. But when you're ready, I know how to be the light. And I think that's important. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Like I said, guys, for those of you that are listening, check out the Reagan Voice Foundation. Melanie and her family have been doing a lot of really cool stuff. We've been talking here in the past, and I believe she is moving forward, getting ready to do some color runs, and there's T-shirts, all kinds of stuff to support the foundation. She's got really nice looking benches that are really and so it's all about being able to carry that message of hope, especially to our young folks, and to educate folks on, the impacts of bullying, the impacts on families. There's so many pieces to Melanie's story and to Reagan's story, and I think that it has an opportunity for everybody to kind of get involved out of it. So I will attempt to attach everything to the bottom of this video. Please don't hold your breath. If not, I will put it in the comment section so that we can definitely have a link to everything. So thank you, Melanie. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Stacy. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. And let's see.